Chapter 11. The City of Gold. "Let's buy some gifts to take home," Bess suggested. Nancy was brought out of her musings about Luis Losa. She smiled. "That's a good idea." The three girls from River Heights picked out various articles. Nancy purchased an attractive salad bowl set for her father and jewel cases for Hannah Gruen and Aunt Eloise. After writing out the addresses where they were to be sent, she asked permission to go into the back room of the shop. It was here that the wooden objects were carved. When Nancy came to Luis Losa's workbench, she paused. On it was a half-finished tray made of canar wood. As she glanced down to the floor, Nancy noticed another unfinished carving. She picked it up. "I wonder what this was going to be," she murmured. Senor Velez came into the room, and she asked him about the object. He came over, took it, and frowned. "I do not know what this is intended for," he said. The piece was about 8 inches long and 3/4 of an inch thick, with a tube inside the center of it. "This is about the size and shape of handles of some of our salad forks and spoons, but we always keep them solid," Senor Velez said. "I found the wood under Luis Losa's bench, so I suppose it's his," Nancy told him. The shop owner frowned even more deeply. "No doubt, but this wood did not come from my purchases. It is Arajanes." "What?" Nancy exclaimed. "That is right," the craftsman told her. "I cannot understand. Luis must have brought it here. I intend to ask him when he returns." Senor Velez put the piece into his pocket. Nancy's mind was already filled with speculations about Losa's work. She said, "Maybe he intended to put something inside the handle." "Perhaps," Senor Velez conceded. "But what? I will certainly make him tell me." On the way home, Nancy told the other girls of her discovery. Instantly, George said, "I'm sure he's up to no good." That evening, Carla had arranged a delightful party for the North American girls to meet some of her Peruvian friends. "It was wonderful, and I enjoyed getting to know your friends," Nancy told Carla after the guests had left. "And what marvelous dancers!" Bess exclaimed. "Oh, I could live here forever!" "And have Dave down here fighting duels?" George grinned. Before leaving for Cuzco the next day, Nancy telephoned Senor Velez. She found him upset. "My assistant has not come back and has sent no word. I called his home to find out why, but nobody was there." Nancy asked the shop owner if he had missed anything from his place of business. Senor Velez admitted that he had not thought of checking, but would look immediately. "Hold the phone, please." Within 2 minutes, he was back. "Luis has taken many of my tools. Oh, it is dreadful, dreadful. Some of them are very old, and I cannot replace them." "I am sorry," Nancy said. "You will report the theft to the police, of course." "Indeed, indeed. And thank you, Miss Drew, for alerting me." Bess, George, and the Ponces were sorry to hear what had happened. They hoped that the police would pick up Luis Losa quickly. "I hope so too," said Nancy. "I am also interested in how Losa got his Arajanes wood and what he was doing with it. Remember, the police in Bariloche found a quantity of similar wood in Wagner's home. I feel sure he has been supplying Losa with it." "Of course," said George. "They're part of the same gang. The question is, what are they doing with this wood?" Carla's mother said she was mortified that their old family mystery was causing such a furor. Her husband smiled. "My dear," he said, "aren't you pleased that these evildoers are being apprehended?" "Oh, yes," Senora Ponce replied, "but I wish the girls could have more fun and less worry." Nancy put the plaque in her suitcase. Then Carla's father drove the girls to the airport. The plane to Cuzco was an old type, which was not pressurized. After it had been in the air a short while, The pilot announced that in order to go over the Andes, they would have to fly at a great height, where the air was thin. The stewardess came to each passenger. She unfastened an oxygen tube from under the window and indicated that it was to be held near the mouth to keep from feeling faint. The scenery below was very beautiful. Mountain crags, forests, and streams blended into a breathtaking panorama. About 2.5 hours later, the pilot announced that the oxygen tubes were no longer needed. The plane was coming down into Cuzco. The girls from River Heights, seeing the city from the air, were amazed at its size. They had expected it to be much smaller. "Imagine living in the mountains 12,000 feet above sea level," said Bess. "Yes," George replied. "And I read in a guidebook this is known as a mountaintop valley. The people who lived here centuries ago were called valley people." When the plane landed, the 4 girls found a taxi, and Carla suggested that the driver take them for a quick tour around the city before going to the hotel. Fortunately, he spoke English, and evidently was quite experienced in lecturing to tourists. He began by pointing out the huge stones in the old foundations of buildings. They were built by the Incas. When the Spanish came, they tore down temples and palaces, but left the foundations and put their own buildings on top of them. The driver smiled. The sun god punished them, though. When an earthquake came, the Spanish buildings fell over, but the foundations remained. Next, he showed the girls a narrow Incan street. Both sides of it had high stone walls, and the driver stopped so the visitors could walk down a short distance to see the famous 12-sided stone which was part of it. Each girl counted the sides and marveled at the way the ancient stonecutters had trimmed this enormous rock to accommodate the ones fitted around it. The young tourists noticed that all the stones were so perfectly fitted that there was not one single opening or crack between them. Not even an earthquake could damage this amazing artisanship. Presently, the driver stopped again, where a modern church had been built on the old Incan foundation. This was where the temple to the sun once stood, he explained. Beyond it, at that time, was a beautiful park with trees, flowers, and golden statues. At the far end was a palace. "How I wish," said Nancy, "that I could have seen them." The man smiled. "If you had been an Inca maiden, you would have been wearing a long one-piece dress made of alpaca wool. Your hair would have been in long braids tied with many colored ribbons of wool. You would have worn sandals and perhaps a sash, as well as a long shawl to cover your head and hang far down the back." "It sounds very attractive," she remarked. "Perhaps you would like to buy such a dress for a souvenir," the guide suggested. All the girls wanted Incan dresses, so he took them to a shop where they purchased colorful shifts. 2 with zigzagging patterns in red and black, 2 with a llama design woven into the cloth. "I can't wait to wear mine at a party back home," Bess said, giggling. When the shopping was completed, the driver took the girls to their hotel and warned them to take it easy. "You would not want to get altitude sickness," he said, smiling. "Walk slowly while you are here." They thanked him for the advice, but as soon as the girls had had lunch, Nancy said she thought they should find the old Indian Mapani. She learned from the desk clerk that the Indian was well known, and he directed the girls to the elderly man's home. It was on a side street and proved to be of rather modern construction. Carla smiled. "I have expected that Mapani would be living in a stone hut with a thatched roof. But the Indians who live here today are quite modern. Many of them have transistor radios and are no longer isolated from the rest of the world." Nancy knocked on the door, and it was opened by a pleasant-looking man, definitely a descendant of the Incas. He was of medium height, somewhat portly, and had large hands with small wrists. His head was broad, and he had high cheekbones and an aquiline nose. The man's eyes were somewhat almond-shaped, like an Oriental's, and his expression kindly and humorous. "Senor Mapani?" Nancy asked. The Indian grinned. "Munanki! Imayan Kaskianki." Nancy's eyes twinkled. "Hukla," she replied. "Yusul Peiki." Mapani looked stunned. In English he said, "You speak Quechua. Please come in, all of you." Nancy laughed and told him that they had heard about him from the guard at the Arajanas forest, and that he had taught them the words. "He said you know more about Inca history than anyone else." "He flatters me," the Indian said, "but I will be happy to answer your questions." Nancy, who was carrying the plaque, now unwrapped it. Carla told of the ancient mystery. "We thought you might help us figure out the crossword cipher." Mapani started to examine the monkey side of the plaque. Suddenly, everyone noticed that all the objects in the room were shaking. The Indian laid the plaque on a table. When it nearly fell off, Nancy grabbed the plaque. The old man had begun to chant in Quechua. "What's happening?" Bess asked, looking around fearfully. Carla's face was pale. "An earthquake!" she gasped. End of chapter 11.